Hey everyone, today we're going to take a look at the Musket and Tomahawk 2nd edition core rulebook. I was generously provided this by Studio Tomahawk to be able to provide a review, and so today I thought I'd just give a quick look at what the contents of the rulebook look like and maybe just give a little bit of ideas of where we're going to see some changes and where some things are going to actually stay the same. For people that are new to Musket and Tomahawks, it's a Black Powder era game that will incorporate various settings within the Black Powder era, both in North America and Europe and abroad, as well as it's a skirmish level game, so it doesn't actually require a really large number of miniatures. It's really meant to simulate actions that are the smaller sort of engagements that would have happened within these periods that would have supported larger battles. In the 2nd edition of Musket and Tomahawks, we actually are presented with a core rule book, similar to the way that Saga is actually now designed in the 2nd edition, with a core set of rules on how the game plays. Where it differs from Saga is that the core rule book for Musket and Tomahawks is about 80 pages long, so it does incorporate a lot of what you would have received in the 1st edition on various rules on things like how boats would work and armory and how all of your unit activations and different types of actions would work. Your basics of how to play are in these 80 pages, as well as quite a bit of detail, even on how various kinds of officers would have traits and things like that you would see in the core rulebook, as well as be expanded upon in the expansions for specific eras. Alongside the core rulebook, there will also be a release of Redcoats and Tomahawks, which will focus on North American settings, such as French-Indian War, American War of Independence, and the War of 1812. And this book will be released alongside the rulebook that I'm talking about today. For many of you that are veterans of the original first game, the 1st edition, you'll still recognize the game that you like to play. It essentially has many of the basic core elements of the game are there that make it feel like Musket and Tomahawks. The spotting mechanic, which I feel is somewhat unique to Musket and Tomahawks, and the reaction tables are still large parts of this game, as well as the troops having disciplines that support that reaction table, and officers having various kinds of traits that you can adopt. Here I'm just showing that there is actually a spotting table. It actually is now a bit more in depth, I would say, and a little bit more detail in there as compared to the 1st edition. From my perspective, the rulebook is really nicely presented and laid out with really a lot of pictorial examples that highlight rules, as well as beautiful miniature photography. Rules are nicely written and easy to read and follow along with. Here's an example where they're showing unit composition and gives a nice example of it in the book. And in this case, I think that it actually is a little more streamlined compared to the 1st edition. You may recognize certain elements that look a little bit like Saga in the way that now units will, have a central figure that they'll actually form around. But as well, there are new rules such as extended order, which allows skirmish-style formations to spread out further. There are also a lot of good examples of really beautiful miniature photography, as I mentioned earlier. And here's a full-page example of that. You may recognize that a lot of the unit actions are similar to what we saw in the 1st edition. I found that movement and shooting to be very similar to the experience with the 1st edition. However, I did actually find that melee seemed to be more streamlined than the original 1st edition rules. One of the larger changes in the 2nd edition is that there are no actual turns in Musket and Tomahawk. It's really meant to simulate a bit more of a continuous gameplay experience. At first glance, the use of cards looks very similar, if not exact, to the 1st edition. When you see the cards here, they're the same kind of cards in most cases, although they do add clock cards, which are a little bit different. Now in Musket and Tomahawks, you will actually hold a hand of cards, that each player will have a hand of cards, and clock cards will determine when you reshuffle cards, like your discarded cards, into the deck, and when events can happen, as well as using cards in order to have your units perform actions, or your enemy units perform actions if you were to play their card in your hand. You also have command points which utilize during this time And you can gain command points by having your opponents perform an action that's within your hand, and then you can use command points in order to perform command abilities instead of using a card. So you're not always bound to use the cards in your hand. And when you perform command abilities, it allows you to activate your troops in various ways, as well as manipulate the cards within the game in various ways. Unit actions themselves, though, as I said earlier, are very similar to the original game. Unit traits within the games covers areas that were covered within the first edition, things such as scouts and elite, and then as well there are actually new traits within the game too. One of these new traits is close order, which essentially simulates regular style troops that are able to form up into columns and perform actions in a line such as volley fire. One of the new additions that I think is going to be a lot of fun is an optional rule where you can allow your officers to duel within the game. This has really its own type of combat mechanic that is a little bit separate from the rest of the game, which I think will add a nice fun kind of activity if you end up choosing to do that. And if you do this sort of optional rule, there are implications for refusing a duel, in which case you will actually minimize the effectiveness of your officer, and as kind of pointed out within the rules, get a bit of ribbing from your opponents. As I remember it, I believe that the armory in the basic rulebook does have some additional options that were not there in the first edition. However, I do expect that the universe books, or I should say the specific era books that come out for different periods within the Black Powder era, will have potentially additional options. I do believe a bit more time has been spent on terrain to delineate both the effects on movement as well as cover, but then as well there's a table included that wasn't in the first edition and has specific types of terrain and how they recommend you classify it, both in its height as well as the type of cover, and even in some cases the type, whether it be an obstacle or let's say an piece of area terrain. Officers will have traits and talents that'll be contained within the era supplements, similar to what we saw in the first edition, but intrigues are included in the core rulebook. These are optional special game accomplishments that you can choose to take, similar to what we called, I believe, I think we called them side objectives in the first edition, if I remember correct. And with these, when you choose to take a intrigue, then your officer is eligible to receive a gift, and the gift would be sort of individual sort of officer kind of trait that you can get just by actually taking on that intrigue. Once choosing to do an intrigue, you can roll on a table that spans several pages in order to get a random type of accomplishment that you need to make. The core rulebook provides 3 different scenarios that you can choose to play, and then there'll be additional scenarios that'll be in the Era supplement books. One of the significant changes in Muskets and Tomahawk 2nd edition is now the use of D10 dice instead of the D6 dice used previously. Within the game, this will affect both all of your actions where you'll be shooting and in hand-to-hand combat, as well as it will affect your reaction table. And tables are built now on the D10. What I think this will do is it's going to allow more room with your modifiers than previously with your D6 experience. Personally, even when I first heard about this on Facebook, I actually have looked forward to this. I actually think that this will be a nice change. After having a quick look at the core rulebook for the 2nd edition of Muskets and Tomahawks, I'm pretty convinced that I'm going to enjoy it in the same way that I have enjoyed the 2nd edition of Saga. Next up, I will review the Redcoats and Tomahawks supplement as well, so stay tuned for that. And for those that are interested in purchasing the 2nd edition of Muskets and Tomahawks, there will be a pre-order on North Star Military Figures that will be next week, according to their Facebook page today.